I wanted to talk to these guys about today is there's a lot of stigma around comic books. There's a lot of people that say, oh, that's for kids, or that's just silly. That just means you're immature, or that just means, you can't read real books because you need books with pictures and stuff like that. It's like Gaston. There's no pictures in this book. How do we get more adults reading comic books?
I think that it's really twofold. I think that part of it is comic book shops and the comic book industry is really bad at getting people into comics. I think that the comic book industry as a whole needs to shift to catering more towards newcomers and creating easy entryways for people to get into comics.
And one of the reasons I like Earth 2 Comics, so that's a branch here in LA, is they have a really good setup where if you're a new person, you can walk in. They have the basic stuff right in the front of the shop, and they have the newer stuff more in the back. So me as a Batman, Spiderman fanatic, I can go to the back and I know, oh, this is where I can get the latest issue. But they have all the new stuff up front. And I really think that, like Kobe said, that's a good direction for comic books to go.
All right. So thank you guys for watching this show. You are watching You Got It with Warrior Woman 91 as usual. And I have Jacob Airey and Kobe. I cannot remember your last name all of a sudden.
That's okay.
I can't remember. There we go. Kobe, he's SLCMOF on Twitter, so that's the important thing. So I wanted to bring these guys on because I needed comic book experts. I am a comic book noob. I don't know anything, or I know very little. I know like the basic stuff from the movies, and I've definitely watched a lot of cartoons because I am that person that sits up at 7 in the morning on Saturdays, 29 years old, and watches cartoons and comic book stuff. So but I needed like some hardcore people. I needed the people that have been around, that have been in this comic book kind of industry for a long time. And these two guys know their stuff. These two guys are the Batman experts. They are I defer to them on mostly everything. What I wanted to talk to these guys about today is there's a lot of stigma around comic books. There's a lot of people that say, oh, that's for kids, or that's just silly. That just means you're immature, or that just means, you can't read real books because you need books with pictures and stuff like that. It's like Gaston. There's no pictures in this book kind of thing. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about is how do we get rid of that stigma? How do we get more adults reading comic books? Because I think that there's a lot of like really good messaging and themes in a lot of comic books that I've come to find, and they're just entertaining just in general. So I'm going to kick it over to Kobe first. How do you think that we can or not necessarily eliminate, but remove some of the stigma?
Wow, that gave me flashbacks to my college days getting cold called. I was just like, oh, you got to go first, or what's the answer? I think that it's really twofold. I think that part of it is comic book shops and the comic book industry is really bad at getting people into comics. When you walk into a comic book store, what's the first thing you see? You see this gigantic wall of new comics, and it's like Batman number 974. Is that not the most intimidating thing? If you're trying to read a Batman comic for the first time and the first thing you see is installment number 974 or 1027 in Detective Comics or whatever it is. So comic book shops are not great, and the comic book industry as a whole is not great at creating a system in which people can get into comics where it's like, okay, and yes, if you ask someone who's at a comic book store, what do I do to get into Batman? What do I do to get into Marvel? They can tell you like, oh, here are 3 graphic novels, and this is what a graphic novel is. This is what a comic book is. This is what a trade is. This is what all these different things. And it's all very, very intimidating for people. So I think that a lot of it really comes from the industry side and the comic book shops, which are typically catered to their comic book buddies that are also experts and love comic books, and that is really who the shops typically that I've seen are targeted for. Now, the very successful ones are actually targeted to the newcomers. That's why they're successful, because they know that the hardcore comic book fans are already going to come into their shop. So part of it is shifting the mindset of who are we trying to cater to, and I think that the comic book industry as a whole needs to shift to catering more towards newcomers and creating easy entryways for people to get into comics.
Jacob, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with Kobe's analysis?
Oh, 100%. He's right. The only thing I would tack on is like if you're an adult, because I've run into this before where like I'll have an adult friend, because I'm 31 and I'll have someone who's talked to someone who's like 25 and they're like, man, but I'm just so worried that people are going to think I'm weird. And I'm like, dude, Orson Scott Card, who wrote Ender's Game and now is a movie with Harrison Ford, wrote this Iron Man novel. And so, I think that that's part of the problem. I know you can't really see it because my green screen is doing weird things, but my point is that's another thing is you gotta let these guys know, hey, you're not alone. There's mainstream writers that you have probably heard of are writing these books as well. And like Kobe says, they appeal to the hardcore fans. Like one of the reasons I like Earth 2 Comics, so that's a branch here in LA, is yes, they have a really good setup where if you're a new person, you can walk in. They have the basic stuff right in the front of the shop, and they have the newer stuff more in the back. So me as a Batman, Spider-Man fanatic, I can go to the back and I know, oh, this is where I can get the latest issue. But they have all the new stuff up front. And I really think that, like Kobe said, that's a good direction for comic books to go. I think that is smart, and I think it'll help people.
Kelly, have you ever been into a comic book shop? And if so, like how many? And is your experience reflective in what I've said?
Yes, I've been to Earth 2 Comics many times with Jacob. Yes. Here's the thing about my entry into comics. First, when I was a kid, I was like, oh no, it's a guy thing. I'm a girl and I'm not gonna like comic books. I'm not gonna like Spider-Man. I'm not gonna like Batman. It's explosions and all of that kind of thing. And then as I got older, I was like, well, no, I'm too old for that stuff. And I think to your point, the kind of daunting nature of comic books, because finally my sister is the one who got into comic books, and now she's like on the level of you guys as far as Batman fanatic. She's got all the comic books, and so she's the one who got me into reading it. But it took her probably 5 or 6 years before I finally was like, okay, this one's actually interesting, and this one's actually interesting, because she started cherry picking things for me. When I first started trying to read comic books, maybe back in, I want to say 2015 or 2016, she was also kind of a newbie, and she handed me one of the very first Incredible Hulk comic books, and she now calls it the Silver Age comic, and I was like, I can't read this. It was so boring. Like it wasn't like a good entry point for me. And I was trying to make it through this book and it was like a set of a bunch of them, and I could not finish it. And so I was like, I don't like comic books because of that one bad experience. And so now years later, now I've got like the Civil War comic book I really like, and I've read House of M. I really enjoyed that one. And then my sister has, I think it's Red Sun, sitting on my desk at home to read. So again, I have not read very many, but now I'm getting like cherry picked ones that she knows are going to appeal to me as a reader. So I wanted to kind of, I know Jacob is like dying for this, but let's narrow it down to quickly 3 comic books that for somebody who just knows nothing about comic books, hasn't seen any of the movies, hasn't seen any TV shows, just wants to start, kind of dipping their toes into the water, shall we say. What are like 3 comic books that you would suggest starting with? And then after that, we can kick it to Kobe.
I always tell people to start with Batman Long Halloween, because for one thing, it's an amazing story. It's written by Jeff Loeb, who also did Batman Hush. We can talk about that one later. That's not on my 3 entry ones, but and it's drawn by Tim Sale. Now the artwork in it's a little niche because they did it kind of in an old school pulp style, so it looks kind of like it was made in the 30s, 40s. But the story is killer. It's about how Harvey Dent became Two-Face. In fact, The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan, starring Christian Bale and so on, a lot of the story was based on it. And it's just how the crazies in Gotham take over the city and unseat, the gangsters and whatnot. It's very good. You get kind of like all the Batman villains thrown at you, but it doesn't bog the story down. So that's a good entry one. And I also recommend Ultimate Captain America by Jason Aaron. And now it's not in the mainstream Marvel universe. Marvel was trying this new thing called the Ultimate Universe, and it was terrible. But this story was really good. It's very patriotic. And basically what happens is Captain America gets captured by the 70s Captain America. And this guy, unlike Steve Rogers, goes off the rails. He's suffering from PTSD from serving in Vietnam. And so he tries to mentally torture Steve Rogers and deciding with him against America. And it's a really good the story. It really captures the identity of Captain America and what Captain America is supposed to represent. I also, and I know this one is kind of a niche one, but I always recommend Sonic the Hedgehog comics because they can be funny, and they are garnered toward a younger audience. But it's a good gateway drug because especially Archie Comics, they did the series. It was just called Sonic the Hedgehog. IDW is doing the reboot, which is also called Sonic the Hedgehog. IDW is more based on the video game. Archie was its own thing. But I really recommend them because it has like all the comic book humor, but it doesn't take itself too seriously. And so then you can go on to more serious stuff. So those would be my big three: The Long Halloween, Ultimate Captain America, and then anything Sonic the Hedgehog. Except the British comic. The British comic is terrible, but any American Sonic the Hedgehog comic.
I'll try to make a list of those and put them in the description so people can go check them out. Kobe, what would your top 3 comic books be for somebody who's just getting started?
Well, I think kind of going off what we discussed earlier, the best thing to get people into comics is something that is more of a gateway than what an expert would enjoy. And what I mean by that is a story that's probably a bit more grounded. For instance, thinking about this at first, I wrote down Crisis on Infinite Earths. But when I think about it more, that's a very intimidating story to get into because it has time travel, it has jumping into different realities and different worlds, it has a bunch of characters dying and mass genocide and all this crazy stuff that doesn't really, it's a lot to take in if you've never been introduced into that world before. So first I would say, and Jacob's probably going to not like this, Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows, which is written by this comic writer named Dan Slott, who I'm not a fan of. But it's good, right? It's good. So, I don't like Dan Slott. I think Jacob would agree. But Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows is fantastic. It's technically not a graphic novel because it's just a compilation of the first 5 issues of this run. So which is not a graphic novel. A graphic novel is something that's more standalone, like The Killing Joke, which is written to be published in that length. But anyway, so Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows is fantastic because, like I said, it's sort of a soft entry. You have Peter Parker with his family, with MJ, who he's married to, and it's a little bit more of a family story, which I think makes it a little bit easier to get into and something more relatable to like a movie or almost a rom-com in a weird way. The next I would suggest is Batgirl Year One. Batgirl Year One is a fantastic book, and I think that it is a great entry into who Batgirl, Batman, and Robin is. And like I said, it really eases you into the story by first introducing you to Batgirl and then introducing you to who Batman and Robin is and a few Batman villains. I also would recommend The Killing Joke as the third one because The Killing Joke, in my opinion, is the best graphic novel ever made. It's a very important book in the history of comics, and it is short. It's easy to read. You'll read it in one sitting. It's very addicting. It's very addictive. So I think if I had to pick one out of these 3 of what people would love the most, it's probably The Killing Joke. It is pretty violent and pretty, intense to get into, but I think it's 60 pages. You get through it really quick, and it's a great story. So that's my 3.
But the movie is terrible.
Don't watch the movie. Yeah, we're talking about graphic novels only. Good point. Thank you, Jacob.
I wanted to just mention, because I left out a part of my comic book conversion story, shall we call it, in between the time, I think, between when I first read that Incredible Hulk comic and when I started actually reading comics. I started watching the TV shows. I mentioned that I watched the TV shows a lot, and that's really how I got into Batman. Obviously, I'm not on the level that you guys are, but I love the X-Men and I love Batman because of those 2 TV shows. Saturday morning as an adult, okay? This is what being single is all about, watching comic book TV shows in the morning. But I think that adults often look at cartoons or look at cartoons based off of what they might call kid material, and they think, oh, I can't watch that because I'm an adult, and that would be degrading myself as an adult, and I have to hand in my adult card in order to watch this stuff. And I disagree, because I think that there's a lot of adult themes in comic books and in even the TV shows, even though kids can watch it. I find that that's how I understand these characters better, and it really helped me to be able to read comic books in general, because now I have the basic backstory. I understand the whole thing with Jean Grey and Scott and all that, just for example, the X-Men have so many characters and it gets so complicated and convoluted. Just to have some of these basic stories down quickly in like a 30-minute show, and that you can just play in the background and listen to, really, that's what really got me to the point where I'm like, okay, even though I haven't read a lot of comics, I still have a little bit of working knowledge of the background of each of these characters and what it's all about, so that if I do open a comic book, I'm not just going in and I'm like, okay, who are these people? Why should I care? What is going on? Why is this confusing? It just is, it's nice to have that grounding. And so my own recommendation for people who are willing to put their pride away and just sit down and watch a couple of these, and then you can just play them in the background and listen to them, then you understand the basics of these characters, and you can go on and read the comic books and not have quite so many questions. Well, who is this Catwoman character, and why is she hitting on Batman? What is this? Like, it just helped me to understand what the heck is going on. It's such a vast universe, as Kobe touched on. You could start anywhere and be confused. And so I just really think that, I don't know, what do you guys think about the TV shows? Do you think that it's something that people have to, have seen in order to be kind of a well-rounded comic book person, or can you just focus on the comics?
Well, for me, growing up in the 90s, it was the peak time for superhero animated series. It really was. And in fact, a lot of people note that, like, because they had Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, Fantastic Four kind of in the early 90s. It didn't last as long as Spider-Man or Iron Man or Incredible Hulk. But a lot of people note that all those animated series were in the same universe. And some people have suggested that Kevin Feige modeled the MCU after the animated universe, although that one was more Spider-Man centric than obviously the MCU is, was more Iron Man centric. I guess we're going to get a Captain Marvel centric universe next, but anyway, that was really the peak time. So a child growing up in the 90s would have at least a passing familiarity with these, and especially with Batman spinning off Superman, and then Superman spinning off the Justice League into the 2000s. You would have a passing familiarity, although for some reason they didn't have a lot of Batman villains in Justice League Unlimited. I would say that, yeah, that is a good point. And I think all the Marvel ones, since Disney acquisition Fox, all the Marvel ones are on Disney Plus. So when your kid's not busy watching, the Wiggles or whatever, you can switch it, because they have a Marvel section. Just go to the Marvel section and get, especially X-Men. The X-Men animated series is phenomenal. It was actually so violent, and like you said, it had some adult themes. I actually wasn't allowed to watch it till I turned 13, because my parents were like, "Whoa, it's got too much social commentary. He won't understand it." So, which of course, Batman with all the gunfire and Commissioner Gordon almost getting murdered, that was fine.
Wait, we're still talking about the Wiggles, right?
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, I agree. I think that not the modern animated shows, which are they're okay, but they just don't have the same gravitas that the 90s and early 2000s one did.
Oh, the good old days in the 90s.
Yeah, the good old days.
Kobe, what is your take on the TV shows, and what would be like maybe your top 2 or 3 TV shows that you would recommend?
So when you think about it, it's like it's like 3 tiers, where the comic book is for the most hardcore person, and they're the most difficult to understand because it has the most number of characters. Characters will just show up who will be C-list characters, and you're just expected to know who they are because their entrance is posed as like some grandiose thing, and you might be like, oh, I don't know who this is. So you really got to know a lot to follow the comics, at least if you're to jump in this week and just read what's going on this week. When it comes to the animated movies, it's like a step beneath that, and then you start with live action films, which is purely intended for everyone to enjoy. And for instance, a Batman film is not really going to feature the Bat family, or it's not going to feature like these other characters. You'll have Jim Gordon and the Joker, but it's not going to be like, whatever, more involved characters that will be less known to you. So I think that animated shows are really the best way for fans to get into the comics, because it will kind of dip your toes into who are these B-list and C-list characters that you haven't seen before, and then you'll at least know who they are and have a working knowledge, kind of like what you said earlier, getting into it. I think that there are a number of fantastic Spider-Man shows. I think that Batman the Animated Series is probably the best comic book animated television show ever made. So I would start with Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series. If I could suggest 2 to get into, those 2 are fantastic.
So I also wanted to kick it back to Jacob, because I know he just has a lot to say on these subjects. So I know you have a very tall stack of comic books, and I wanted to make sure you at least got to touch on at least some titles. So what is basically in your comic book library, Jacob?
Everything, but no, I'm kidding. It's mostly Batman stuff because I'm a huge Batman fan. My favorite era of Batman is when Chuck Dickson and Denny O'Neil were writing Batman. I have one right here. This is I had to turn off my background because they weren't appearing, but this is Joker's Last Laugh. So this Joker is actually the one that Mark Hamill's character in Batman the Animated Series is based on. He's incredibly violent, but he's not, I don't want to, because he is a serial killer, but he's not like how modern writers kind of make the Joker, where he's just like this genocidal maniac for no reason. This Joker is very methodical. He's very smart. Chuck Dickson is probably the best writer of the Joker, hands down. He also is the co-creator of Bane, fun fact about him. So I always tell people, if you want to get into Batman after watching Batman the Animated Series or even watching the Nolan trilogy, read Chuck Dickson, because his stuff is probably the most connected to Batman the Animated Series. The characters are similar. The costumes are similar. He kind of repopularized the Joker wearing the purple suit. I know Frank Miller gets a lot of credit for reinvigorating the Joker, but that was really Chuck Dickson. And also Denny O'Neil, who just passed away. His death was a big loss to the comic book community. Such a talented writer. If you're into Spider-Man, I actually am not a fan of the ongoing Spider-Man series that Marvel has right now. They've introduced way too many characters, like Kobe was saying. So it's hard, even for a longtime Spider-Man reader, it's hard for even me to keep up. So this is a standalone that Marvel did. It's called Spider-Man Season 1. And it's just basically a modern retelling of Spider-Man's origin. It's got all the base characters. It has the Vulture, which people will know from Spider-Man Homecoming. I recommend if you're like, hey, I'm more interested in Venom. I don't care about teenage Spider-Man. I've got Spider-Man Carnage. You're going to want to know about Carnage. He's going to be in Venom 2, which I think is called Venom Let There Be Carnage. Greatest movie title ever. This is a really good story. It introduces you to Spider-Man, to Venom, to Mary Jane. Not the fake Mary Jane that's in the MCU films, but the real Mary Jane. This is my very first Spider-Man comic. One of my cousins gave it to me as a birthday present. I think I already mentioned this one, but Ultimate Iron Man. This is like a new take on Iron Man because he actually has superpowers in this one. Usually he just has the suit. This one he actually has powers, but it's written by sci-fi master Orson Scott Card and got amazing artwork by Andy Kubert. I really highly recommend this one. Again, Ultimate Comics was awful, but Ultimate Captain America by Jason Aaron and then Ultimate Iron Man by Orson freaking Scott Card.
That's
fantastic,
crazy.
Fantastic work.
So, Kobe, if somebody were to break into your LA apartment and go looking through your comic book collection, what would they find?
They would find a lot of Batman. They would find a lot of DC Rebirth. I was really good at collecting that. So every couple years, DC and Marvel, basically to get money, they relaunch their entire brand and they start everything from book one. And a lot of what they're doing is kind of what I actually discussed at the beginning, which is they're trying to appeal to new audiences and be like, okay, here's a starting point. And then they will do that. And then the thing is, it's actually awful for fans because then that's their starting point. They get into it and then they cancel everything. They say that's all gone. We're gonna retcon that doesn't exist anymore. Everything you read is fake. Now read this. And so they have good intentions, but it never really works. And it's all, of course, kind of for money, but it does work. And I really love Rebirth. So if I could recommend, if you're looking to get into DC Comics, look at Rebirth, just get volume 1 of everything. There are a couple things that are not good in Rebirth. Deathstroke is not good. Flash is okay. Green Arrow's okay, but then you have like Superman, which is really good, Batman, which is really good, Batgirl's okay. So it's kind of 50-50, but nothing is really terrible in Rebirth, at least not at the start, which is pretty good. Jacob is probably thinking of at least one or two things that was really terrible. There was like one or two things, but by and large, everything was really good. At the start of
Crisis was awful. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point.
That was part of Rebirth. That's why I said that. It was
yeah, you're right. That's a good point. So yeah, you'd find a lot of that. You'd find a lot of old Batman stuff. I remember when I was young in like 2008, 2009, I would buy all of these Batman back issues because they would be the cheapest things. So like these $1 Legend of the Dark Knight, Jacob, from 1989 when Legend of the Dark Knight
that
stuff.
Was a great run too.
It was a long time ago. The art is really outdated, so I have a lot of that. So yeah, you'll find a lot of that. It's all good stuff. I don't really buy bad comic books, so it's mostly good stuff.
Jacob is always the person that's like thinking of the snarky comment to say right afterwards, and he's probably like, I'll be the judge of that.
Well, no, Kobe's absolutely right. Like my only complaint is Batman Rebirth was good for the first 50 issues, and it was like after 51 it just fell off. So get Batman. It's written by Tom King, who I was sorely disappointed in because he's such a good writer. And then 1 through 50 is great. 51 literally through, I think, was it 85? Because he was supposed to have 100 issue 1, but he was getting such bad reviews, DC actually fired him. Yeah. So 51 through 85 is terrible. I haven't tried James Tynion. I was hoping they would bring back Scott Snyder, who did the fantastic New 52 run. Him and artist Greg Capullo, who Image fans would remember. Greg Capullo illustrated Spawn for a while when Tom McFarlane was mistreating his writers and artists. He's a fantastic artist, and then his pairing with Scott Snyder. I actually got a mean email from Scott Snyder one time because I wrote a bad review of his Batman Last Night on Earth, which is kind of like an alternate tale. It's not really that good. And so I said it's not really that good. And he sent me a mean, snarky, sarcastic email. And I'm like, dude, have you read any of my other reviews of your other crap that I've just been praising? And I don't like this one thing, and I get a mean email. So that was fun. I sent him links to other reviews, but he's never responded. So fun story for it. This is a true story, by the way. I have the receipts, as we like to say on social media.
I did want to go through my library, which is very, very meager when it comes to actual comic books. But as I mentioned before, my favorite 2 comics that I have are the Civil War comic book. I think it's because it's not like Spider-Man Civil War or Captain America Civil War. It's just the Civil War one. And then House of M I really enjoyed. I think, Jacob, you were the one who said it's not that good. And I read it and I was like, well, it's not the best thing I've ever read, but I enjoyed it anyway.
No, I liked House of M. I didn't like its. I don't like its. Because Marvel always does these connecting stories that really. Yeah. I don't like the connecting stories, but I do like the main House of M story arc.
Okay, well those are like the 2 that I own, and then the third that I own is I have 1 issue of the Dark Phoenix saga, and I love that whole storyline. I think I have the DVDs with the cartoon that actually goes through the whole story. But that's where my actual collection comes in, because I have some of the X-Men seasons. I have some of the Earth's Mightiest Heroes TV show. I really love that one as like an introduction to the Avengers. And then the Justice League TV show. I think that was from 2004. Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. Although Justice League itself, season 2, just glorious, fantastic, wonderful, amazing, billions and billions. I go full on season 2 of the Justice League TV show, and then obviously I don't have any of the seasons just yet because I can just steal them from my sister who has all of them. But Batman the Animated Series is really, I think, where you should start with watching any cartoon series, because even if you don't like comic books, even if you're not even trying to get into this, how many awards did that show win? The soundtrack alone is solid gold. It's amazing. So those are my recommendations for people who want to either get into watching comic books or I should say watching the TV shows based on the comic books, or reading the comic books, and not just like being stuck in that, I'm going to go see the yearly Marvel movie every year. If you want to get further into it, here's a nice, easy way to start. That's my recommendation. But my final question for you guys, and this is actually a Jacob-inspired question, because Jacob is always talking about supporting your local comic book stores. I'm actually going to ask it to Kobe first, though. Kobe, what are some comic book stores that you recommend people support, especially during COVID?
Well, I'm from North Carolina, so I had a bunch of great comic book shops that I love to go through in North Carolina, and I still am in contact with some of those. My favorite is Ssalefish. It is SS, so there's 2 S's, Ssalefish. And that comic book shop is great. They have really done a lot of kind of what I was talking about at the beginning, at making it appeal more towards new users. Every year on Free Comic Book Day, they had, a bunch of vendors come in, and it was just a great show. And they would have writers come in that would sign things, and it was just a great time. So, I really missed that. And like I said, since COVID, it's not been a lot. Also look for a lot of local comic book shops will have their, backlog listed online, and you can order from them, which is, a great thing to do as opposed to ordering your comics from like Amazon or something like that. Then you can, order from them, and while they're not unable to sell their back issues, they could ship them to you. So that could be a good way to support as well.
Jacob, what are your suggestions? I know Earth 2 Comics is probably on the list.
Yeah, Earth 2 is on there. They have 2 locations, one in Sherman Oaks, which is in the Valley in LA, and then one in Northridge. They're both equally good. I tend to shop at Sherman Oaks more because I go in there so often. They know me by name, and they're like, "Oh, Jacob, new Batman's out. You got to go check it out." They know my buying habits and everything. I also want to recommend Crusty Bunkers, which is actually owned by Neil Adams. He is a very popular Batman writer. He wrote Batman a lot during the 80s. Same time Frank Miller was writing The Dark Knight Returns. Now he owns his own comic shop. He makes appearances there, signs autographs, which are expensive, by the way. I know because I got one. I highly recommend that place. It's fun. They're still new, so they're not quite as organized as, like, say, Earth 2 is, or like Golden Apple. I know a lot of people like Golden Apple comics, but I still highly recommend it. They've got everything you want. Of course, Neil Adams being a Batman writer, there's a ton of Batman stuff. So if you're just like a diehard Batman fan, it's definitely a place to shop.
So my 2 recommendations are also Earth 2 Comics in Sherman Oaks, because that's one of the few comic book stores I've ever been to. And then there's another place, I cannot remember the name of it. It's in Fremont, California, where I used to live, and it's on the intersection is Bond Way and Fremont, I think. I'll put the name of it in the description when I can figure it out what it was called. But I like that place because it was like a warehouse, and I felt like I was like robbing something when I went in. But then all the walls were covered in comic books, and oh my gosh, my sister walked in there and nearly passed out. She was so excited. But it was kind of fun because I don't want to use the Batcave reference, but it felt like that because you would not know that it was a comic book store from the outside because, as I said, it looks like just this warehouse where they might house parts for cars or something, and then it's like this decked out comic book store.
I did have one more for all my fellow Texans in Beaumont, Texas, which is a crappy town. Just kidding. I have family there. I'm just throwing shade at it because I have family there. But there's a really great comic book store called Book Stan with no D. It's STAN, like the Snyder stands. Anyway, sorry, that's an inside joke. Anyway, I highly recommend Book Stand. It's great. They have an amazing collection of older comics. So like me and Kobe were talking about, getting older stuff. So you're, to kind of be a gateway drug into collecting full time, hopefully. Their selection is endless. You can find anything in there. I even found, for those of you unfamiliar, the 90s Spiderman had a spinoff called Scarlet Spider. I found the whole collection there and bought it out. Came back a couple months later. She had already restored it. Don't know how she did that. Very impressive. So I highly recommend comic, or it's just called Book Stand. Oh, and they also host trading card tournaments. I'm not into that, but if you're into that, she does that, all different kinds. So yeah, I highly recommend that place as well.
Kobe, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I was just going to say, as a final tip to people trying to get into comics they can be quite expensive. So what I would always do is you go to Comic Cons and conventions and even local ones. Like I lived in this city in North Carolina called Winston-Salem, and we'd have Winston-Salem Comic Con. Okay, so publisher or comic stores would come in, and what you do is they're always selling their back issues at a great price. And back issues, I just realized I didn't explain what that meant earlier, and there are people watching that probably don't know. But back issues are just old comics that are in store. So you can go and you can get great deals on these back issues because typically they're trying to go and they're just trying to make as much money as possible. The comic stores, they're trying to make a couple $1,000 in one weekend. So they're going to sell off these comics. And what a lot of people can do, if you really know what you're doing, you also can find comic books that are on sale for like $1 that are worth like $150. That's happened to me before too, because they're just, throwing stuff in the boxes trying to sell. And then you can notice those things. So obviously you're probably not into that aspect of the comic book industry, and it's very difficult difficult to make money like flipping comic books. So I wouldn't really recommend getting into that. Although it's a great way to get into it, to go in and be able to buy, because when you are at those cons and they have back issues, you can buy like comics for 25 cents, 50 cents, $1. So you can just buy like 50, you can buy a whole run for, $50 or something, which is even better than buying the volume trade issues. So that's one tip as well.
I actually had a dice thrown at me at a Comic-Con. Some person was playing like some dice game, and I walked by and made a comment about a poster that was at the dice section, and he threw a dice at me. Needless to say, he didn't get his dice back. I still have it. So ha.
The moral of that story is don't cross Jacob.
Yes.
So
Never.
I really appreciate you guys coming on the show. Thank you guys so much. Again, Jacob Airey and Kobe SlickMoth on YouTube. I will link all of their channels and information in the description below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell because I'm weeping. Please, people, what is wrong with you? And I will talk to you guys on the next video.